Welcome to lesson number 2. The first lesson was the test drive on Ephesians 2, and now we are going to focus on how did the Bible come into being. That is on page number 9 of your handouts. If you go to page number 10, I just want to show you a snapshot of the pages to follow. That is on page number 10, how the Bible come into being. There are actually 4 steps, major steps. The first one is the traditions. Then you have languages. The third one is councils. And then the fourth one is empires. Those 4 items are very important in how the Bible came into being. Let us go to the first one, traditions. There was an oral tradition, and then it slowly evolved into a written tradition. The languages, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and some parts in Aramaic, and then it evolved into Greek, the New Testament, and into Latin, and then into the English language. If we go to the councils, there are 3 major councils that is important to be aware of in how the Bible came into being. The first one is Jamnia. It was a Jewish council about plus minus 90 AD, and that is where the Old Testament was fixed as it is in the Bible. And then the next one was Carthage in about plus minus 397 AD. The early church accept the decisions of Jamnia and Carthage. The third one is at Trent, 1546 AD. Now, Trent is located in northern Italy. The Roman Catholics officially defined the Catholic canon, which included the Apocrypha. So that is the snapshot of the councils. Then the empires in this process. You first have the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, and then the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great, and then the Roman Empire. This is just a snapshot of the pages to follow. Traditions, languages, councils, and empires. You have a question on page 11. Why should we have some understanding of how the Bible come to us? Why do you think? Joe?
It reinforces our trust in our views and shows and explains what was going on in the Bible.
You're right. You're right. It's about trust. And you will see at the end of this lesson that there's no book in the history of the world that came into existence like the Bible. We need to have reverence for this book. So the Bible is an amazing book, but you will get a better understanding of that if you understand how the Bible came into being. The first thing to know that it was a very complicating process. And in this process, there are 2 words that is important to know. The first one is Apocrypha, and the other one is canon. I'd like someone to read the first paragraph on page 11. Who likes to read that? Thank you, Jackie.
The Bible did not just simply drop from the sky, but it came into being through a fascinating but complicating process. To best understand the process, we need to be aware of the dispute regarding which books are or are not included. The books that made it into the Bible are called the canon. Canon is a Greek word which means a rule or measuring line.
Thank you. Any questions? So the books that made it into the Bible, and that was decided by the councils, we call canon. Who likes to read the second paragraph? Thanks, Bob.
A canonical book therefore passes the test of being authentic, genuine, and of divine authority and inspiration.
Please continue.
The debate regarding the canon and Apocrypha stems back to an early church and the Greek translation of the Old Testament known as
The Septuagint.
After Jerusalem had been sacked by the Romans in 70 AD, there was another
diaspora
of Jewish people all over the world.
Just to interrupt you there, the diaspora is just a scattering of people.
Spoken and written in Hebrew, remain being strong and the lands of Judea and Palestine, as opposed to Alexandria, the home of many Greek-speaking Jews. The lack of familiarity with the Hebrew scriptures gave impetus for Greek-speaking Jews to translate the Hebrew scriptures. This translation is called
Septuagint.
Septuagint. There were other writings circulating in Alexandria, especially which were being widely read. These writings were included in Septuagint. These writings are called Apocrypha by Protestants. The word Apocrypha comes from the Greek word meaning hidden or concealed. The term generally refers to religious writings found in the Septuagint and Latin Vulgate, but not in the Hebrew Bible.
Just like to summarize that page for you. The canon are those books who made it into the Bible. And the books that did not make it into the Bible, and councils decided on that, we call the Apocrypha. So what happened in 70 AD, Rome destroyed Jerusalem. Then many Jews scattered all over the world, and many settled in Alexandria. And then, and they spoke Greek in Alexandria. So they wanted to have the Hebrew Bible in Greek, because they were Greek-speaking Jewish people. And then the Old Testament Hebrew Bible was translated in Greek. And that's we call the Septuagint. But in Alexandria, we need to know that there were more Jews living there than in Jerusalem. And there were other writings also circulating. So they added to the Greek Hebrew Bible, or the Greek Old Testament, some other writings. And we call that the Apocrypha. But that did not make it into the Protestant Bible. But the Catholics put it in their Bible. And we will get to that a little bit later. Page number 12. Who likes to read the first paragraph? Thanks, Don.
What is the significance of the Apocrypha? For Christians and Jews, these books represent a continuation of sacred writings in the Jewish community up until Christ came. They paint a picture of the cultural and religious mindset in Judaism before the appearance of Christianity. They set the scene for the coming of Jesus and help the reader to relate to the social and religious context Jesus found in Israel.
Thank you. If you look on the screen, you will see the three main groups in this complicated process: the Jews, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Protestants. Now you can go back to your notes and just fill in the missing words. The Jews did or did not accept the Apocrypha as part of their scriptures. What do you think? They did not. Protestants did or did not accept the Apocrypha as scripture. They did not. The Roman Catholic Church did. They did accept the Apocrypha books because they believe it contributes a lot to the information about what happened between the Old and the New Testament. Any questions? I think the most important thing to know about this process of how the Bible came into being, that it was very complicated, very difficult to understand. Let's go to our first point, the traditions in how the Bible came into being. The first one is the oral tradition. Who likes to read that paragraph for us? The oral tradition. I'll read it for you. The Bible evolved, that is page number 13. The Bible evolved over a time span of approximately 2,000 years. The time span can be divided in an, that's the missing word you need to fill in. What kind of tradition? Oral tradition. And the second word you need to fill in? Written tradition. The oral tradition is likely dated to the time of Abram, around 1800 BC. Before anything in the Bible was written down, people told stories about God and God's relationship with people we now read about in the Bible. The oral tradition lasted for many years as families passed along the stories of the ancestors to each new generation. In the case of the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, some stories were told for centuries before they were written down in a final form. So what we have in the Bible, it was first the oral tradition. They just pass it on. And then the second one is in the traditions will be the written tradition. And that is on page number 14. Who likes to read the first paragraph on page number 14 about the written tradition?
Okay.
Thanks, Don.
Eventually, as human society in the Near East began to develop forms of writing that were easy to learn and use around 1800 BC, people began to write down the stories, songs, psalms, and prophecies that would one day become a part of the Bible. These were written on papyrus, a paper-like material made from reeds, or on vellum, which was made from dried animal skins. But all the books found in the Old Testament were not written down at one time. This process took centuries. While some books were being written and collected, others were still being passed on in storytelling fashion. Some very old copies of both the Old and New Testament writings have been preserved, and they are now stored in museums and libraries around the world. Once the stories of the Bible began to be written down, it became necessary to make new copies before the old ones wore out from repeated use and became unreadable. Sometimes several scribes made copies, while other scribes read the text aloud. The books of the Old Testament were written over several centuries, beginning in the 10th century BC, by which time the Hebrews were settled in Canaan or Palestine.
Thank you. I will take us through the last paragraph. The Old Testament, in roughly the form that we know it, did not emerge until after the return from Babylonian exile around 500 to 450 BC. Likewise, the New Testament underwent a similar process of development, although in a much shorter time frame. The first letters of Paul were written around 45 to 50 AD, the first Gospel, Mark, around AD 60, and the last of the canonical epistles around AD 90 to 200. Rolls of papyrus, plant material, and parchment, animal skin were used. So I think just look at the screen. You just need to know it was first the oral tradition, and then it evolved into the written tradition. That is how the Bible came into being in many, many years. The second one is the languages, and you get that on page number 15. We're not going to read that. I will just explain it to you because it's very obvious. The first language will be Hebrew. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew because that was the spoken language at that time. And then then it evolved into Greek, because when the New Testament was written, the spoken language of the time was Koine Greek. The New Testament, Greek; Old Testament, Hebrew. The other language will be Latin. The Roman Empire, following the Greek Empire, you have Greek, and then you have the Roman Empire, then you have Latin. And we have now the language, the Bible in so many languages, and then also in your own language, English. So Old Testament, Hebrew, and then the New Testament, because it was the time of the Greek influence, it's Greek, and then the Roman Empire, Latin, and then many other languages like English. Any questions?